Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Michael Anderson, and I'm the President and CEO of the Oklahoma City Museum of Art. Thank you all for joining us virtually this evening for a special presentation by Dr. Bryn Schockmel. In May 2019, the museum was awarded a Provenance Fellowship funded by the Samuel H. Kress Foundation in partnership with the Association of Art Museum Directors. The fellowship provided funding for a researcher to investigate our collection, making it possible for the museum to take a more comprehensive approach to in-depth research into the provenance of the works of our collection. Dr. Schockmel came to the museum with an Italian Renaissance concentration, having studied at Skidmore, the Courtauld in London, and Boston University, where she received her PhD. Dr. Schockmel also worked at the Clark Art Institute, the Harvard Art Museums, and the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. So when we were able to hire Bryn to do this work, we were extremely excited and confident that she would be able to complete what we thought was an ambitious schedule of 20 works that we were asking for in-depth provenance research on. Well, I can tell you that as of the conclusion of her fellowship, which we are all extremely sad over, Bryn has not just done 20, she's done 120 works that we now have outstanding original provenance research on, and that will be shared on our website as part of her fellowship. But Bryn didn't stop with just exceeding her goal by a factor of 6. She also has curated a couple of exhibitions, including one currently on view, Art with a History, which will run through November 29th. That exhibition is generously supported by the following sponsors: the Association of Art Museum Directors and the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, Leslie and Cliff Hudson, Annie Bohannon, Billy Lee Neese and Alan Montgomery, Joan Frades, Vicki and David Hunt, and Joan Payne. So thank you all for your sponsorship of that exhibition. It's truly outstanding, and now you're going to kind of see some of the research that went into that exhibition and into those 120 works that we are, again, just so very pleased and grateful to have Bryn complete in her time at the museum. Tonight's presentation is being recorded, so for those of you joining us live, you can type questions for Dr. Schockmel into the Q&A module at any point during the presentation, and we will select a few of those questions for her to answer immediately following the presentation. Now, without any further ado, I welcome Dr. Bryn Schockmel.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to all of you for joining us for this virtual evening. As Michael said, for the past year, I have been researching a wide variety of works of art in our collection, a few of which I'm showing you on the screen here and which I will be talking about with you today. This research has culminated in an exhibition, Art with a History, which is on view at the museum through November, and I hope you'll have a chance to stop by and see it. Now, when we talk about provenance, we are talking about the ownership history of a work of art, from the time it was created until the time it was acquired by the present owner, in our case, the museum. And this is important for a number of reasons. Knowing the history of an object, how and where it was displayed, who owned it, this adds to its cultural, its historical, and also sometimes the monetary value of a work of art. And we, of course, want to know that a work was acquired legally at every step in the process and that there's no red flags. So general questions we ask ourselves when doing provenance research are, did the work change hands legally? Was it ever a forced sale or a sale under duress during times of war? Was it looted or stolen? And in particular, we want to look closely at works of art that were in Europe between the period of 1933 and 1945, during the time when the Nazis were systematically looting art across the continent. So it's important for museums to do their due diligence, to do their research, and to make this information available to the public. And as a provenance researcher, I have a number of tools at my disposal to help with this research. So one is the object files. These are files that we keep here at the museum for every work of art that we have in our collection. And this includes details of how the work of art was acquired. Was it donated? Was it purchased from a gallery, bought at auction? It includes information about loans to other institutions for exhibitions. We have copies of pages from exhibition catalogs, details on conservation, correspondence, all those sorts of things. this is a great place for me to start my research into an art object. Then, of course, there's the work of art itself. On the front, we might have a signature or a date, but it's really the back of the work that often has a wealth of information. We might have labels or marks from past owners, including sometimes handwritten notations. There could be labels from dealers, galleries, auction houses, places where the work was displayed. All of this can provide a real history of where an object has traveled throughout its life. As a researcher, it's perhaps not surprising that I rely very heavily on books. We have exhibition catalogs, auction catalogs. A particular type of book called a catalogue raisonné is very helpful. This is a complete listing of all known works by an artist in a particular medium. So you might have a catalogue raisonné that's all the paintings of Monet or all the sculptures of Michelangelo. That's a very helpful resource for a researcher like myself. And so I use books a lot. We also more and more now can use online resources. A lot of older material, things that are now in the public domain, have been digitized and we can access online. Museum websites might provide exhibition history. I can do a lot of genealogical research online, which is very helpful with provenance work. There's all sorts of different databases, some of which I'll talk about more later in this talk. And as of late, with my access to libraries becoming somewhat limited, I've relied more and more on these online databases. And finally, we have archival material. Though much now is available digitally, sometimes one still has to go to the source and look through these records. Records from dealers, from auction houses, from collectors. I was fortunate enough to travel to the Getty in Los Angeles at the end of February, and they have a whole Provenance Research Institute there, and I went through a number of files that were very helpful in my research. And we keep archival material here at the museum too. We have newspaper clippings, scrapbooks, brochures, press releases. All of these sorts of things are very helpful tools when doing my research. So that's a bit of background about how I go about conducting my provenance research. Now I'd like to delve into a few case studies of works that have been particularly interesting that I've really enjoyed learning about. And I'm going to start with this painting. This is Giuseppe Maria Crespi's Portrait of a Woman Holding a Mask. It's an Italian painting that dates to about the year 1700. And this painting is in the exhibition Art with a History. And so you can see here on the screen, I started my work with some exhibition catalogs, and I knew from these catalogs that the painting was exhibited in Wiesbaden in Germany in 1935, and then here in the United States, in Baltimore in 44, and in New York in 62. And when I tracked down these catalogs, I learned about this information from the catalogue raisonné on Crespi. When I tracked down the catalogs themselves, I was able to learn who lent the work of art at the time of that exhibition, who owned it at that time. And I knew that in 1935, it was owned by a private German collector. It didn't give a name, it just said a private German collector. In 1944, it was in the collection of a Dr. Fritz Hausmann of Berlin, but it was lent by someone else, by Jacob Hyman of New York. And by 1962, it was in another private collection of Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Erlanger. And this was confirmed by some labels on the back of the paintings. We have a label from the Baltimore Museum of Art, and then on the right, this is one of my favorite labels on any of the paintings, if only they were all this clear. It says, Portrait of a Girl by Crespi. This is the property of Hilda Erlanger, given to her in 1945. That's very helpful for me. So I've got this great information. It's a really good start, but I have this crucial gap between 1935 and 1944. And I needed to figure out if the painting changed hands during those World War II years. I knew it was in a private German collection in 35 and then owned by Dr. Hausmann of Berlin in 44. So I start to dive a little deeper and see what I can figure out. And I do a search on a database called Fold3, which keeps a lot of records related to Nazi art looting. And so I do a bit of work and I come across a document that gets me a little bit worried. The document that I'm showing you here on the left, where the arrow is, you can see that's the name of our artist, Giuseppe Maria Crespi. And then on the next line, it says the collection of Dr. Hausmann. And this is a list of looted works of art. The part that I couldn't quite make out is where it says Zug des Silent. This is, of course, in German. I knew that Zug means train, but I was like, Silent, is this some sort of euphemism for train of silence? So fortunately, I have a friend who's a lawyer in Germany, and so I sent her this, and I'm like, Steffi, could you just tell me what this says? But she, being a lawyer, went above and beyond for me, did a bit of digging. Turns out Zug des Silent actually refers to a different painting, the Triumph of Silenus, which was in fact looted and not returned until 2007. So it's not our painting, which was a relief, but still, I need to figure out some more information. I was able to finally track down a catalog that really helped me. I found this at the Clark Art Institute Library. This was a journal published in 1931, and this was all about the collection of Dr. Haussmann. And you can see on the right-hand page, there's the painting that was looted, but then it talks about a second painting by Crespi of a girl holding a mask. So I know now that Haussmann owned this painting in 1931, and he still owned it when it came to the United States in 1944. So fortunately, our painting was not looted. It has a nice clean provenance for the World War II years. Still have a few other things to sort out. There's a label on the back for the Art Institute of Chicago. I reached out to that museum, and they were able to tell me from their records that our painting was there in December of 1944 as a possible purchase consideration, but they of course ended up not buying it, which is how it was able to finally come to our collection. A few other labels that are a bit unclear. And then finally, this is the big mystery. There's this very cool wax seal on the back of our painting that I just have not been able to figure out yet. If anyone has any thoughts on what this might be, I would love to hear them because it really is quite a mystery. So when I finish up my provenance research on a work of art, I then write up a paragraph that looks like this. And it includes all of the information, and it's very specific about how we use punctuation to designate direct transfers. The official version has lots of footnotes, and all of this information will eventually be put on the website so that other researchers will have access to this material, because it's important when we do this provenance research to make it generally available. Another painting that I worked on that was very fascinating is Courbet's painting Gorge in the Forest, or the Black Well, which dates to about 1865. This is not in the exhibition, but it is on view in our permanent collection on the second floor. And it ties in because I also had some initial worries that there might be Nazi art looting connections with this work. So I was again able to put together a preliminary history using books from auction catalogs. I knew it was sold through galleries in Paris in 1908 and 1920, and then it was sold again in 1967 at Christie's in Munich, and it was at that time in the collection of someone from Munich who had inherited it from her grandmother named Lisa Bonaire. So I have this gap again during the World War II years. So I continue to do some research. I search on the Fold3 database, and I initially run into some trouble. Here's Lisa Bonaire, a woman who owned our painting, but this is about a Delacroix, and it actually turned out to be a false alarm. So that was okay, no problems there. Keep going. Now I look at the work of art itself. And so on the left, you see the back of our painting, and you can see there's a cover there, and our lovely preparators removed that for me so I could see what was underneath. And in the upper left corner, we have this label, which is very clear, and it says Modern Gallery Wertheim, which is a gallery in Germany, and then there's a handwritten bit, there's a number 22, and then there's a title. So this is a good lead, a good clue for me to follow up on. I'm able to find the catalog for this exhibition. The wonderful interlibrary loan system here in OKC got this book for me, the 1930 catalog for this exhibition. It is, of course, in German, but in the introduction, it tells us that one of the lenders to the exhibition was a man named Franz Bonaire, who I think was maybe connected to Lisa Bonaire, the owner. So I'm looking through this catalog. Our label said 22, so I go to painting number 22, and it's clearly not our painting. Ours is a landscape. This is not. So then I'm like, let's go to the landscape section. And here we have a number of paintings that sadly aren't illustrated. And so based on the dimensions and the titles, I narrow it down to 3 paintings that might be our work of art. The first, number 37, has a close match in terms of titles and dimensions. The river that they named there is a river in eastern France near Ornans, the artist's hometown. Number 62 has the same title as our painting. De Puit Noir is a subtitle for our painting. And this is a subject that Courbet painted a lot, but the dimensions are much farther off. Number 47 was actually the closest match with the title and the dimensions. But what's unusual is that though it's written on the back of our painting, Felslandschaft by Utrecht, this is not what our painting looks like. This is Utrecht. It's an area in northern France on the coast that was painted by many artists, Courbet, Monet. Our painting shows an area in eastern France closer to Switzerland. So maybe the curator of this German exhibition just was not very familiar with his French geography. Maybe the labels just got mixed up, but the fact that the label is there indicates to us that our painting was in this exhibition, and the husband of the eventual owner is listed in the catalog. So a bit of genealogical research allowed me to learn that Franz Bonheur died in 1941. His collection passed to his wife, Lisa, and when she died, it went on to her grandmother. So that tells us that this, again, had a nice clean provenance for all of World War II, stayed in the same family from 1930 until 1967. So that was another happy ending. And my trip to the Getty turned up a bit more information. There I was able to find the stock books of the Theheim Gallery. The Theheim Gallery bought the painting from Christie's in 1967, and here we can see their records. They bought it on December 5th, and the very next day they sold it to an Edward Carter. And the invoice, which I'm showing you on the right, tells us that they actually purchased it specifically for him, for his collection, and he then paid them just over £9,000 for this Courbet back in '67. And Edward Carter actually went on to amass quite a collection of art, much of which he donated to LACMA in Los Angeles. He was actually one of the sort of founders of that museum. And there we have the provenance. So it's quite complete provenance for this. So switching gears a little bit, this is William Hamilton's painting of Sarah Siddons, and it dates from about 1780. Sarah Siddons was a famous stage actress in England at this time, and she was painted by a number of the great artists of the day. And so it can make it sort of difficult to trace the provenance because there are just so many portraits of her. But fortunately, our painting has a lot of information on the back. Here I'm showing you the whole thing. You can see some labels, some notations, and then when we zoom in, here are some of the handwritten notes that we have on the back of this painting. Some of it is a bit hard to make out, but we can definitely discern 3 different names, T.F. Ford Bowes, Barnard Trollope, and Adelaide Greatheed. And that last name has a date with it of 1861. So using these names, and also a name that I had from the Christie's catalog when it was sold in 1975, which is O.M. Heber Percy, I started to do some genealogical research. And British genealogical research in particular, one can do fairly easily on the internet. There are so many websites and parish records and lists of noble families. You can track down a lot of these names through their estates, things like that. So I do a lot of digging, and you can see here's my notes. I put together this very complex family tree, but in the end I was able to figure out that it did stay in the same family the whole entire time. And the reason that the last names kept changing is because a number of these owners had no children, and so would pass to a niece or a nephew. And so they get all these different names, but it did stay in the same family for well over 100 years. And so we have a nice complete provenance for this work. So I'm going to change gears a bit now and talk about some works on paper, because doing provenance research on prints or drawings is different from doing research on paintings. When I first started working on this drawing, which is by an Italian artist named Stefano della Bella and dates from the mid-17th century, I knew very little about it, other than that it was purchased at Sotheby's in New York in 1982 and then subsequently donated to the museum. Fortunately, this drawing has something called a collector's mark on it. In the lower right-hand corner, it's hard to see, but when we look closely, there's a small mark that's the letters GL. And this is what's known as a collector's mark. Many collectors of prints, drawings, and other works on papers would stamp their objects right on the front with their own personal seal. It might be a symbol, it might be letters, something like that. It seems a bit odd to us today, but that's what they did, and it is quite useful for us when we're conducting research. Because once we find those marks, there's a specific database, the Fritz Lukes database, that we can go to search for them. This database was originally a whole series of books, and now it has been very helpfully digitized. And so I can put in the letters GL, and I came back with a brief little biography of this doctor, Georges Laporte. So that gives us one sort of starting point. Georges Laporte lived from 1873 to 1947, so we know a bit about him. But the next question with the drawing is, what was it used for? Because drawings were often not done as a complete work of art themselves, but as a means to an end for some other project. So I did some research on Della Bella, the artist. He was incredibly prolific. And I found another drawing, which I'm showing you at the left, which has a somewhat similar composition. This was a design for a table ornament, something that he had made for the Medici family, although it seems like it was never fully executed. And then I'm also showing you on the right a print, which has a similar composition to it also. And they are reversed, but this would make sense because in the printmaking process, images do become reversed. So maybe this drawing was a preparatory work for some other project. So this one's a bit of a work in progress. There's still things we need to learn about it, but we've got a good start. And finally, I'd like to turn to one of what I think is most interesting works in our collection in terms of its provenance, and that is Rembrandt van Rijn's etching, The Raising of Lazarus, which dates from about 1642. And this work, when I started on it, we already knew its recent provenance, and that was that it was part of the Vincent Price collection at the Sears department stores. So in the 1960s, the Sears Roebuck department stores decided that it wanted to try to sell fine art in their stores around the country. And so they partnered with Vincent Price, who was a great actor, but was also a connoisseur and a collector of art himself. And they gave Price a budget, and he then toured all over the globe, tracking down works of art that he brought back to the United States that Sears then distributed amongst its department stores. And our Rembrandt was at a department store here in Oklahoma and was purchased by the museum in 1965. And Price actually visited Oklahoma a couple years before that to celebrate the opening of the collection at the local store. And we have here some records of that visit. A former director of the Oklahoma Art Center, Nan Sheets, kept incredibly meticulous scrapbooks of everything relating to art that happened in Oklahoma City. And here we have her invitation to the various receptions, a newspaper clipping of Vincent Price when he came, and then at the right, I think my favorite, a letter that Vincent Price wrote to Nan Sheets thanking her for her hospitality during his visit. So that's its more recent history, but I of course wanted to go a bit further back. And it can be harder to trace the earlier history of a print because prints can be made in multiples. We could have many, many, many Rembrandt etchings of this scene, which we do. And so how do you, when you're reading books and records, determine which one is our Rembrandt? Well, again, it's helpful if we have a collector's mark. And in this case, we did. So when I flipped it over, in the upper right corner, we have these letters. And these really puzzled me for a while. At first, I thought maybe it was an OAC for Oklahoma Arts Center, but I realized that wasn't right. And so I tried in the Fritz Lukes database that I mentioned earlier, that database of collector's marks. I tried searching all different combinations of letters. I tried A and L and C and D. I finally realized that it is in fact an LAL. Part of it's a bit smudged, but it's an LAL. Stands for Sir Lionel Arthur Lindsay, who was an artist and collector himself who lived in New South Wales in Australia. Lindsay died in 1961, so it's possible that Vincent Price acquired his Rembrandt etching directly from Lindsay's estate during his travels, though I haven't been able to confirm that yet. And so there's the provenance of our work. And I just think it's so interesting to think about our Rembrandt traveling from the Netherlands, where it was first created, to Australia, and then finally here to Oklahoma City. So that brings me to the end here. Thank you so much for your time and for listening. And we are now going to turn it over to some questions.
Hi, Bryn. It's Brian joining you from the sound booth, and we do have a few questions. I think the most important of all comes from the Wigan household, who are joining us this evening. And in all seriousness, their question is: are you a Red Sox fan?
No. I grew up in New York State. I was only in Boston for grad school, but I have to admit, not being a baseball person much at all, so I'm not really an anything fan. The Red Sox are more of an annoyance for me when I was in Boston than anything else. Sorry.
Again, apologies to the Wiggins household.
Sorry.
Another question that may seem more broad, posed by, I'm sorry, from a visitor who's listed as anonymous on the Q&A thread, asked a question about cost and how much did the museum pay for the Rembrandt piece. I know this is a question we can't answer, but would you explain why?
Yes, so prices, of course, fluctuate so much over time, and it is when I'm going through our records and I see old bills of sale, it does sometimes amaze me for how little something seems to have sold for at one point versus what its value might be today. And tastes change. So something that might have been incredibly popular during the Victorian era, for example, and sold for a fortune at that time, might now really be out of vogue and would sell for very little. And so prices do fluctuate quite a lot and change a lot. And so it's not something that we tend to disclose, but it can be a useful tool for us when we're doing our research, knowing what a value was for something at a time, and it tells us about what types of art people did value at that time, what was popular in a particular era, what might people have been displaying in their homes, or what might have been less popular and sort of tucked to the side. So that's helpful internal data for us to have when doing this kind of research.
Thank you, Bryn. Our next question comes from T.S. Akers. What's the most interesting label from the back of a piece you've come across?
Ooh, well, definitely that wax seal on the back of our Crespi, just because that's so mysterious and really is bothering me. We also have the trickiest ones is when I can't figure them out, and so sometimes we'll have a ripped label or something like that. We have a very cool stamp. We have this wonderful Renaissance panel that's in the exhibition. It's one of the oldest works in our collection, an Italian Renaissance panel that dates from about 1500. And right before we temporarily closed for the pandemic, we had a professional photographer came in and was photographing both the front and the backs of some of our works. And sometimes it can be very hard to see these marks unless we're in just the right lighting. And so he set up all these lights, and on the back of the Renaissance panel, we have this stamp that tells us it was in Paris, which that's very interesting because as far as I've been able to tell so far, this panel was in Italy up until the 1920s when it was brought to New York. And the stamp's very faded and you can only sort of see it when just at the right angle. But that one I've been trying to work out, did it just pass through Paris on its way to New York? Was it maybe there for an exhibition? So that one's a bit of a mystery. But we definitely have some cool labels on the back. It's always fun when you flip over a work of art because you never know what you're going to find. Sometimes it's very disappointing and there's nothing on the back, and sometimes like the Hamilton or our Georgia O'Keeffe, it's just a wealth of information. So it's a bit of a mixed bag at times.
And so all of our viewers know, if you're capable of visiting in person, much of this content is listed on the object labels next to the works of art in the exhibition.
Yes, we've blown up some of the details so that you can see them when you come to the museum.
Our next question: how do you determine which pieces to include in the exhibition, or how did you?
That's a great question. So I wanted to have a diversity of objects in the exhibition. There's 13 works of art total, and it's a mixture of paintings, sculptures, drawings, and prints. So I wanted a bit of everything in that sense, and also chronologically, geographically, I wanted to have a real mixed bag. But mostly what I was looking for was works of art that had an interesting story. So there's not too many modern works of art in the exhibition because, you know, something that was created in 1980, its provenance might be created by the artist. She had it displayed in a gallery. We bought it. That's fairly boring. So I tended to look for works of art that had a really interesting story and that would let me introduce different aspects of provenance research, because there's so many different facets of what we do. So there's research connected to Nazi art looting, there's genealogical research, there's marks for drawings, looking at different galleries. So I tried to have a diverse selection in terms of the objects themselves and in what stories they were able to tell, and to maybe get some things out of the vault that hadn't been on display in a while so that people could see some really new things, something that they might not be familiar with.
Thank you for that question. And our next few questions, I'll summarize a couple of them into a two-part question. One, how did your training, how did your education, how did this prepare you to study provenance? And additionally, what have you learned since your fellowship in your practice of doing this research? Is there anything that you've improved upon along the way, or found a way around a roadblock, for example?
Great questions. So provenance is something I've been interested in for actually a really long time. My very first semester of undergraduate college, I took a class called Den of Antiquities that was about the looting of ancient objects. So the Parthenon marbles in London, for example. And that really sparked my interest. And my sort of focus as an art historian has always really been on like the physical object itself. Where was it displayed? Who owned it? How did it pass hands? And so my sort of research interest as an art historian has always tied in with provenance research, and I've done a lot of provenance research through my art history classes over the years. And then as to what I've learned since I've been here, I've learned so much. I was very fortunate to participate in a provenance roundtable at the Nelson Atkins Museum in January, where a bunch of provenance researchers from around the country and around the world actually came together. And I learned so much at that conference about not just resources such as different databases and tools like that, but also sort of good practices for going about provenance research, how to do exhibitions. The Nelson Atkins had a really wonderful exhibition in their galleries on works of art that had connections to Nazi art looting, and that was a source of inspiration for me when putting together our exhibition. And so being able to talk with other researchers, my mentor, Nancy Edwards at the Kimball Museum, has been a wealth of information. So being able to connect with researchers and other institutions, and of course with our own wonderful staff here, has really helped me grow a lot as a researcher.
Our next question, and you, again, this is a question that you cannot directly answer, but it was posed. Did you find anything of questionable provenance? Could you explain? Oh, please go ahead.
No, I can answer that, and the answer is no. If we had found something of if we had found something of questionable provenance, then it would be our duty to take the appropriate next steps of, you know, contacting the original owners, things like that. But I'm happy to say that I did not find anything. But some of the works that I highlighted, the Crespi, the Courbet, this is why it's so important to dig into those works that were in Europe during World War II to make sure that there's no problems. Because if we had come across anything, we would have taken the next appropriate steps, but we did not. So everything so far is looking good.
And I apologize, because usually this kind of research is behind the scenes. It's not something that many institutions are forthcoming about, or create exhibitions such as ours around the topic.
You're absolutely right. It has been something that's been sort of a bit more behind the scenes in the past, but I think, and I hope that is starting to change and things are becoming more transparent, and museums especially now that so many more museums have websites that can be searched. They're putting this sort of information out there for the public to have access to.
The next question, I want to save a few for later, but this one I think is interesting because your report, in a sense, is the exhibition. This person said, "Love your presentation. Will there be a written report?"
So there, I've put together a document that has all of the provenance of everything that I've researched with footnotes, so that anyone can be like, oh, she found this information in this catalog, I can go double check that. And that document is going to be put on the website soon. It's all just, needs its final touch-ups. So that will go on the website, and so that people can then see the provenance of everything that I've worked on. So it's not a report per se, but it is sort of a summary of all the research.
One of our viewers said, "We are so fortunate to have you with us for this past year." What is next for you, Bryn?
Well, I'm happy to say that I have fallen in love with Oklahoma City, and so I'm going to be staying in the area. It's just such a great city, and thriving art scenes and restaurants and music, and now that things are opening back up again. So I'm really happy that I'm going to be staying here and getting to explore things some more. I still have a whole list of things that I want to do in the area.
One more question. One more question about your research. How do forgeries play into your research of provenance?
Oh, that's a good question. So forgeries, obviously they're going to have a sort of trickier provenance, and I don't really have the skill set to detect if something, unless it's blatantly obvious that something is a forgery. That requires, chemical analysis and all sorts of things like that. It's not really something that I've had to deal with here, but it's certainly, it can be a tricky thing if one comes across something that seems like maybe it's not an original. Often provenance is how one discovers if something's a forgery, because if you have a Vermeer that just magically appears on the record, starting in the 1930s, well, where was that Vermeer before? So provenance can help sometimes in determine or detect if something is a forgery if it has no provenance. So that's sort of another reason why we do provenance research, to really trace an object's history and prove that it's sort of legitimate.
The next question is 2 parts, and
Okay.
I believe this is our final question for the evening.
Okay.
What was your favorite object in the exhibition to research?
I think my favorite was probably the Renaissance altarpiece that I mentioned earlier. I didn't include it in this presentation, so you're going to have to come to the museum to see it. It's this incredible, it's the left wing of a triptych. So a triptych is a 3-part painting. And our triptych it's an Italian painting made around 1500, brought to the United States in the 1920s, and then it was actually broken up, it was sort of dismembered for sale, because the gallery knew that they could make much more money selling each piece individually than selling the work as a whole. So we have the left panel. The center one is now at the Oberlin College Museum of Art, and the right panel is still in a private collection. And so that one was interesting because it changed hand a number of times over the past 100 years. It was in a few different private collections. It was put up for auction 3 different times, and then finally came here in the 1980s. But since my background is in the Italian Renaissance, it was really exciting for me to work on a painting from a period that I'm so interested and familiar with, and that had such a cool story.
And then the second part to that question, outside of this exhibition, what was your favorite object or experience at the Oklahoma City Museum of Art this past year?
Ooh, what a good question. I've had so many positive experiences, it's hard to narrow it down to one. We've had so many good exhibitions. I loved renewing the American in the fall, and I loved Pop Power Now. Honestly, what I'll remember most from my time here is that from day one, everyone has just been so nice to me. It's just been such a welcoming environment. Everyone's been so kind. And I think that's just true of sort of Oklahomans as a whole. And so I'll just remember the really positive relationships that I've had here.
We feel the same way about you, Bryn. And on that note, thank you to Dr. Bryn Schockmel. Thank you to our donors and members and to all who joined us for this program. We look forward to seeing you in person at the museum and online, including future virtual programs and by visiting okcmoa.com. Again, thank you.